So we're gonna start with what everyone's most curious about, all the legislative updates. It's been, during session it was moving fast and furious, but at the end we sort of ended on a disappointing note with not a whole lot actually passing, particularly in terms of new funding. So we're gonna go through some of those points now, and really I think the regular session was mostly remarkable for what didn't pass, rather than what did. Amy, if you want to go to the next slide. So we'll start with the budget. That's where most of the school finance changes happened this session. The budget right now is awaiting controller certification. So the Texas, as you all know, is a balanced budget state. We can't spend more than what the controller says the legislature has available. That's not really a problem this year, as y'all are well aware. The state has billions and billions of dollars in surplus. They didn't really tap a whole lot of that this session, unfortunately. But we're not going to have any problems with the controller certifying that we're within our means this time around. The budget continues the funding that was put in place by House Bill 3 in 2019 and House Bill 1525 in 2021. And so that's one bit of good news, but nearly all new funding above that is contingent on bills that didn't pass. So we sent out a lot of stuff, for example, on House Bill 100 during this session. That talks broke down in conference committee on that bill. That bill didn't make across the finish line. Some of the big school finance bills didn't pass. We ended up with a much more moderate school safety bill. The big property tax relief bill, there's various versions of that. The House had House Bill 2, the Senate had Senate Bill 3, 4, and 5 that all provided some various forms of property tax relief. None of those made over the finish line this session. And so everything kind of got caught up with the voucher debate, and we'll talk about that more here in a little bit. Amy, if you want to go on to the next slide. So here's what's in the budget. If it has a check mark next to it, that means it is funding that is coming to us. It's passed, it's ready to go. So you can see current law tax compression. All of those districts that were at the floor are currently at the floor. They have generated additional property tax compression that the state has to use to bring down the ceiling for everybody. That's about $5.3 billion. So the state has to lower that ceiling. And I've talked to some of you all about how to hack your templates to get that to reflect what's in the budget. And we'll talk about that more during the next presentation. But that is in the budget. That's continuing current law tax compression. Also, there's an increase in the golden penny yield. This is probably going to be the largest source of new funding for y'all for next year. I'm using, for those in Zoom who can't see me, I'm using air quotes here for new funding because it's really just the continuation of current law. Current law requires that the golden pennies be, the yield is calculated based, there's sort of two tests. One based on the basic allotment and another based on property values across the state. Because property values have grown so much, now that property value test is pushing up the golden penny yield, right? So before, for this current year, 22-23 school year, the yield was 98.56 for the golden pennies. That because it was tied to the basic allotment. Now with the property value growth across the state, that's picked it up, and it's going to be $126.21 for the 23-24 school year. And $129.52 for the 23-24 school year. I'm sorry, 24-25 school year. I think the template, the latest Region 13 template already reflects those assumptions. We've kind of known that since, I think, about January when the LBB first put out that initial draft of the budget. So that should really be in there. And all the runs that we've been putting out on House Bill 100 and what you'll get from us when we do our post-legislative thing on Friday, that'll all reflect these higher golden penny yields. TRS Active Care, there was some additional funding there to maintain the annual premium growth to less than 10%. That's not especially exciting news, but at least there is some money to keep that growth down a little bit. The House had proposed, I think, close to double that amount of funding to keep the growth, I think, around 5 or 6%. That ultimately didn't pass. This is the Senate's proposal to sort of cap it at around 10%. So that's what we ended up with this session. The curriculum appropriation is contingent. You can see here it's contingent on legislation, but 1605 actually passed. And I don't believe it's signed by the governor yet, but it's on its way. I think it's sitting on the governor's desk. And so since that bill passed, there's an appropriation for that in the budget. If your district participates in that program, again, we'll talk about that more later, you could draw down some of this $500 million. All right, Amy, thank you. So the instruction materials, this is the instruction materials allotment. If you guys remember way back to last session when we presented on the results of that session, they reduced the instruction materials allotment funding by quite a bit because of the subjects that were in the declaration or proclamation rather. There were fewer topics in that proclamation last session. This time they've restored that back to close to normal levels, and so that's this appropriation in the budget. Next up is school safety. School safety is contingent on another piece of legislation passing for those funds to start flowing. Fortunately, House Bill 3 has passed, so those funds, those changes to the school safety allotment will be made. And again, we'll talk a little bit more about that later on, but pretty modest changes to the school safety allotment in terms of funding, but pretty big changes when it comes to consequences for not compliance, right? So kind of an unfortunate development there, a little lopsided. We'd rather have additional funding and a lighter touch from the state, but that's not what we got this session on school safety. Increases in NIFA. So for those of y'all that are building new instructional facilities in your district, that funding is now back up at $100 million for the biennium. And by our projections, that means there won't be any proration for NIFA this next biennium. And so that's good news there. Then we get to all the things that, all the ones that got away here. We have the additional property tax compression. That's in the budget. So there's a line in the budget for that, but it's gonna sit there until they pass legislation that authorizes it. Okay, so right now there's $12.3 billion just sitting in the budget, waiting for a bill to come along to spend it and provide some additional property tax relief for folks across the state. And so again, it was going to be contingent on Senate Bill 3. The House and Senate could not agree on what they wanted to do with property tax relief. They still can't agree on what they want to do with property tax relief. We'll talk about the latest on those discussions later on. But until they come to an agreement, that $12.3 billion is going to be sitting in the budget. Same story for school funding increases. There's $4 billion sitting in the budget right now. The budget, again, that's been approved and it's over at the Comptroller's office for certification. There's $4 billion for school funding increases there. We were waiting on House Bill 100 to pass, but as I mentioned, talks broke down. They couldn't get an agreement on that. So we'll have to wait for a special session to be called on school funding. And when that happens, and hopefully they can get their act together and approve a bill that increases school funding by $4 billion. The reason 100 failed in large part is because of the governor's insistence on passing a voucher bill. This is something that really just sucked all the oxygen out of the room during this session. There were various voucher bills. There's Senate Bill 8. They put House Bill 100 was trucking right along, and then the Senate put vouchers in that, which ultimately derailed it and killed that bill. And so just pretty much everywhere you looked in public ed this session, vouchers were disrupting the policy discussions that were occurring. There's $500 million for school choice in the budget. Again, we expect the governor to call a special session probably later this summer, maybe even into September, on school choice, and we think he's going to tie again school finance with that call. So I don't think we're the governor, unless the governor backs down, I don't think we're going to really get any school funding increases unless he gets what he wants on vouchers. I think the last thing on here is virtual education for those of y'all that serve students virtually. Right now, as we sit here today, there is no funding attached to any virtual student. You will not get funded for virtual students unless it's through the virtual school network. So if you're a provider through there, then you can generate some funding. But if you serve students through the local remote learning programs that were stood up by Senate Bill 15 during the, Amy, was it the second called special session of
yes,
the 87th?
Yes, the second called special session, last session, yeah.
There's too many special sessions. So that, if we think back to that, Senate Bill 15 and the second called special session during the 87th, that created what's called local remote learning programs, where you could serve up to 10% of your students locally online, and then that would generate ADA that was eligible for the Foundation School Program. That everything created by Senate Bill 15 had an expiration date. That expiration date is September 1 of this year. So they weren't able to come to an agreement on that. And so right now, if nothing happens, we'll hit that expiration date, and then virtual ADA through those local remote learning programs will no longer be eligible for funding. And so what this appropriation is essentially, there was a bill, the Senate version of House Bill 681 would have moved all of virtual ADA under one umbrella. So instead of having the VSN and local remote learning programs, it would have put it all under a new chapter in the education code and funded everything based on ADA. For those of y'all that are familiar with the virtual school network, you may be aware that that funding is based on completion. So if the student, they don't have to, it's not tied to attendance. If that student just completes the course, completes the grade, then you can generate funding through the virtual school network. But the Senate version of 681 would move everything over to ADA, and so that would cost about $50 million. You have a question, Jaime? No, okay. I just saw a furrowed brow. I didn't know if that was disappointment in this or that was a question. Okay. All right, Amy. Slide.
Josh, before you get off virtual education, can you talk a little bit about what the House version of this bill would have done compared to the Senate?
Yeah. So really the House version was just kind of a shell bill. All it did was just strike the expiration dates. And so just continue the current law, sort of the VSN and the dual framework of VSN and local remote learning programs would have just continued that into the future. Whereas the Senate bill kind of took those frameworks and put everything under one umbrella. And so this appropriation is tied to the Senate version of the bill because there's a little bit of a cost there moving from completion to ADA. If we just continue the House version, then there wouldn't be a cost.
Yes, and I believe the Senate version tried to incorporate a lot of the recommendations that came out of the Virtual Education Commission that met during the interim. So that's where those recommendations come from, or the proposals in the bill. That's where they came from.
Okay, so we sent out a little note to folks whenever they pass the final version of the budget. And if you clicked on one of the links in there, it took you to a little video of several representatives talking about how great this budget was for public ed, that it was the largest increase in public education funding in the history of the state, the greatest thing since sliced bread. And anyone that voted against it was voting against the greatest increase in public education funding, blah, 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 blah. We disagree with that characterization wholeheartedly. They were counting a couple things that traditionally don't count towards public ed funding. For example, those TRS changes we mentioned earlier, funding for enrollment growth, right? I mean, the state always funds enrollment growth. They were counting that as part of their major accomplishment this session. They were counting those golden penny yields going up, which is just current law. That's not anything the legislature really had to do. That's just continuing the promises they already made. That's not really any new funding over current law. So they had some very selective math behind that claim, and it was really frustrating to see that argument play out on the House floor in particular. And so we wanted to put out sort of the way we see the budget as an alternative, we think more correct way to understand what our friends in the legislature did to public ed this session. And so here's how we see things. This is taking Article 3, which is the public education article of the budget. It includes, Article 3 includes TEA and higher ed, but we're just looking at the FSP portions of Article 3. So we have FSP state aid for M&O, FSP state aid for INS. You can see the strategies listed there. These are under the TEA section of the bill. 87th legislature, that's last session. The total there was 51.7 billion. We go in that same section in the budget for this session, see what they actually passed. So not what's contingent on other bills being approved, which we just saw a number of bills have not been approved. We just look at what they actually appropriated during the regular session. That total is 48.6 billion. So I don't see the greatest increase in public education funding there, right? I see a $3.1 billion decline in the appropriation the state made. And so again, if you are hearing this claim being echoed, I would encourage you to share this information, and so that way folks can understand what's actually going on, and just really the fact that we're looking at this kind of data, this kind of appropriation in a session when they had $33 billion in GR surpluses, when they had another $27 billion in the rainy day fund, is I think really unconscionable. And so you know, hopefully we can get some of this restored during a special session. But that is where the legislature chose to end things at the end of the regular session.
Josh, before we move on to the rest of the presentation, there's a question in the chat. Diana asked, so unless virtual education is addressed in a special legislative session, funding for under SB 15 would be ending. Is that correct?
Correct, yes. All funding for your local remote learning programs will turn into a pumpkin on September 1, 2023. It's going to expire. All those provisions in the code will expire. And so if you're serving kids through those local remote learning programs, and if you are, you're probably familiar with it. There's all these academic screens you have to, all these boxes you have to check through the local remote learning program if they don't get funding, if they have a certain number of days absences, if their grades fall below a certain mark, if they don't pass the STAR. So you should probably, if you're serving students through this way, someone in your district is probably tracking those things. So I'd imagine you're aware of it. But yeah, all of that funding for those local remote learning programs expires or will not continue as we sit here today, will not continue for the 23-24 school year. We have communicated this repeatedly to the governor's office and particularly the lieutenant governor is aware of this and is really supportive of getting this on the call. But ultimately, it's the governor's decision. And the really frustrating thing with this virtual stuff is you can't just flip this stuff on and off, right? There's this whole infrastructure behind virtual education that takes time to get up and running. You have to have the staff in place. Like if I'm a virtual teacher at a district, am I going to stick around when I don't know if I'm going to have a excuse me, I don't know if I'm going to have a job next school year? Right? There's all these, bigger picture planning things that need to occur. If they have a special session in September to restore virtual education, well, that's great, but we're already, started the school year by that point, and we're going to have to scramble to get staff and all those and get all that infrastructure stood back up. And so, I'm hopeful that gets corrected during a special session, but the timing is going to be really critical.
Thanks, Josh.
All right, what do we got next? All right, I'm going to let Amy take it from here.
Okay, and I'm going to mute the room because I think I can hear myself. Okay, good morning, everyone. Thanks for having us present today. Sorry I couldn't make it down to the Valley for this presentation, but I do hope to see you all this summer at the School Finance Operations Conference. So for the next handful of slides, I'm going to talk about notable bills that we were tracking this session. We'll touch on HB 100 that did not pass, but all the other bills after this slide are on their way to the governor or sitting on his desk right now. So Josh and I have talked about HB 100 a lot over the last several months. You guys have seen side-by-sides that we have sent out comparing HB 100 to current law, comparing those House versions to current law, and then also Senate versions that came out. And we were definitely tracking this very closely. And we want to echo the disappointment we have that this bill did not pass. So, but how far did this bill get? In late April, the House passed out a version of HB 100 that would have provided about $5 billion of increases to funding, school funding in the state of Texas. There were many, many provisions that would change just about every allotment outside of the regular program allotment to be based on enrollment rather than ADA. There were basic allotment increases, that's that $6,250 in fiscal year 24 and $6,300 in fiscal year 25. There was also several new allotments that dealt with book safety, fine arts, advanced mathematics. This bill, the House version of this bill had a lot of good items that we would have welcomed in our state. However, there was a substitute that was by the Senate chamber. It was voted out of the committee in late May on the 22nd, and then subsequently voted out of the full Senate chamber on the 23rd. This version, the Senate version of that bill, as Josh mentioned earlier, included vouchers, that $500 million earmarked for vouchers, and would have provided about $4 billion for school funding increases. Just 2 days before session ended, we got news that night that this bill would not make it. And as Josh mentioned before, mostly due to vouchers being tacked on and lawmakers not willing to welcome that new development. And moving on to bills that did pass, Josh mentioned HB 3 earlier. This bill has passed both chambers as of the end of session and has been sent to the governor. I believe it's sitting on his desk right now, but has not been signed. This bill makes some pretty moderate increases to school safety. We've seen different versions that would have increased the school safety allotment to $100, but ultimately the school safety allotment in the enrolled version of this bill lands at $10 per ADA. So a whopping 28 cents increase there. The bill also includes an additional $15,000 per campus. And we're not exactly sure what kind of rules TA will propose on this $15,000 per campus provision. We've been recommending to districts to only, when they're hacking their templates, which Josh will show you later, to include only regular instructional campuses. So we're not including those alternative campuses, not including your JJAPs or any of those. This bill doesn't come with a lot of funding, but comes with a new big requirement. Most notably, this bill would require that every campus have at least one armed individual during regular school hours. The school board would determine how many armed individuals would be at each campus, and schools can obtain a good exception clause for this requirement. But from our reading of the bill, it would still require some sort of armed individual on campus. HB3 also allows TA to put in a conservator or a board of managers if a school district is not meeting those school safety requirements. This bill also allows for TA to limit what kind of bond proceeds can be used towards districts' bond proposals if the district is not compliant with these school safety requirements. So a little bit of funding, lots of new requirements for this bill. Josh mentioned the curriculum bill, HB 1605 earlier. This bill was written or authored by Representative Buckley. So far, it's been sent to the governor for signature as of very end of May. And this bill would begin in the upcoming 23-24 school year. This bill deals with curriculum materials, making sure that the TEKs are aligned with those and really focusing on getting high quality instructional materials to teachers in hopes that it would reduce their preparation time. So this bill would create a new allotment. It's called the new additional state aid for state approved instructional materials allotment, another mouthful. This allotment would give districts $40 for every enrolled student so that they can buy instructional materials. And these instructional materials would be provided, the state would be provided by the state, and TA would purchase these open educational resource materials, the OER. So funds from this new allotment with a long name, they would not be given through the Foundation School Program. Instead, they're going to live in the credit of a district's instructional materials and technology account, which would be maintained by the TA commissioner. The state does, or this bill would also add another allotment, the additional state aid for open education resource instructional materials. And this would provide another $20 per student for printing and shipping costs for all of those high quality instructional materials. The next bill that deals with a little bit of funding for school districts and charters across the state is HB 2205 by Representative Lozano. This was signed by the governor just a few days ago. I apologize, we have a question in the room, so I'm gonna try and unmute the room now. Can you guys do that from there?
On the previous slide, I just want to make sure I understand this. On the previous slide, so this is additional funding based on student enrollment, the $40 per student and the $20 per student. So that's a total of $60 per student. That was not on this year.
Right. If you buy the state's approved curriculum and get it printed. Yes.
Yes.
All right, Amy, I'm gonna turn off my mic. We'll turn off all the mics, so hopefully there's no feedback, but we'll just click it on if we have questions.
Okay, that sounds great. Yes, so for HB 1605, this does not require school districts to adopt the new statewide curriculum. And the additional funding that would be provided by this bill only goes to districts that actually adopt the new curriculum. Thank you, I did not make that clear earlier. Yep. So back to HB 2209, we're pretty excited about this bill. This bill establishes the RPEP program, also known as the Rural Pathways Excellence Partnership. This bill, which came out of South Texas, also allows small districts, and by small we mean districts that have less than 1,600 ADA. It would allow these small districts to form a collaborative partnerships with other small districts or institutions of higher education and other businesses to generate some additional funding. Most of these partnerships would be focused on career and technology education programs, CTE programs. And I think it's really about how districts can maximize their resources together. So this bill creates a new allotment, and then it also creates an outcome bonus under FSP. So the allotment would provide $10, I believe $10 per student that participates in this program. And then the outcomes bonus would be provided to the district after a student graduates and meets, has certain certifications that would qualify for the outcomes bonus.
I think we had a quick question here.
Yes.
The question for those in Zoom was for 1605, would you see that on your summary of finance? I know for sure the $40 would go through the IMTA. I think that's also the case for the $20 for printing, but I'm not 100% on that. So the $40 definitely will definitely not show up on your SOF. $20, I don't think so. I think it's all going to go through the instruction materials technology development. And again, the question was only if you use the materials. And so yes, these are resources that are to help districts purchase those that curriculum and those instruction materials. Yeah.
Okay, some other bills that would provide some miscellaneous funding that came out of the 88th legislative session include HB 3708. This is also another bill by Representative Buckley. It was sent to the governor last week, maybe a week and a half ago. And this bill creates a new allotment under the Foundation School Program. So you would see this on your SOF. This funding would go to school districts that allow homeschool students to participate in their UIL activities. So each student that participates in these activities would generate $1,500 per activity. So this bill is going to be effective September 1 and will apply to the upcoming school year once the governor signs it. Another miscellaneous funding bill, SB 1647. This was sent to the governor for his signature a few days ago. This bill would allow school districts and charters to use public or private dropout recovery education programs so that they can provide an alternative for students who could be at risk of dropping out or at high risk. And administrators, counselors, and teachers would be the one reviewing these students to see if they are high risk. So the dropout recovery programs, they can be offered on campus, remotely, or in a hybrid of in-person or remote instruction. And again, this bill would begin with the upcoming school year once it's signed by the governor. We have some miscellaneous bills for tax rate adoption. We've been tracking HB 44 pretty closely. This year, the session, it was sent to the governor for his signature just a week ago. And what this bill does is that it removes the calculation of the no new revenue M&O rate for school districts and basically changes that, replaces it with the M&O rate to maintain. And this is the rate that would require, I believe, a super majority to adopt. So essentially, this bill would align the Chapter 44 tax code definition of rate to maintain with the, I'm sorry, not Chapter 44. It would align the tax code definition of rate to maintain with the Education Code Chapter 44 definition. So this is something we don't have to worry about this summer because the bill will not go into effect until January of next year. So this is a substantial change, but it's going to be a next spring, next summer problem. Next bill we have dealing with tax rate adoption is SB 1997, again sent to the governor last week or so. This bill would require some source documentation to be linked when completing certain controller worksheets. And I believe this mostly deals with the CADs. And again, this is not going to be a this summer problem. We will, the bill is effective in January, so we will deal with this next spring, next summer. So as Josh mentioned, not a whole bunch of bills that were passed that will change school funding for school districts across the state. There is some money that is earmarked, most notably that $4 billion. And we're hoping to see new special sessions called by the governor that will have these items on his priority list. For the first special session, however, the first special session was called about 3 hours after the House and Senate adjourned on the last day of session just last Monday. There was a property tax bill that did pass the House during the special session. HB1 by Representative Meyer would provide a uniform 16.2 cents of tax rate compression if it were approved by the voters on the November 7th, 2023 election. The Senate version, there's a Senate version of this bill. It would only provide 10% of uniform tax, 10 cents of uniform tax rate compression. And this would not be contingent on any voter approval. The Senate version is different in another way. It also includes $100,000 amount for the homestead exemption, the state mandated homestead exemption. That part, however, would be contingent on voter approval. And I know this part gets a little bit confusing because, you know, if this bill is not going to go to the voters until November and you guys are working on adopting your budgets and your tax rates this summer, how is that all going to work? So under the House plan, districts would still adopt their tax rates under current law. Josh will teach you how to hack that template a little bit later. Then if HB1, this new HB1 from the first called special session, if this bill passes and is approved by voters in November, the assessor collector will calculate a new levy using the reduced rate. So if this bill passes and is approved by the voters, your adopted rate, the rate you adopt this summer, is not going to be the same as the levied rate, which would be calculated by your assessor collector. So after the House passed this bill, they adjourned sine die. I think it was maybe like 12 hours, 15 hours after the special session was called. Governor Abbott released a press release and has been quoted all over Twitter applauding the House for passing legislation that was in the scope of the call. And the scope of the call very specifically told lawmakers to provide additional tax relief using by reducing the MCR. The House did that with that 16 cents, and the Senate sort of did that, and then tacked on a homestead exemption increase to $100,000. So the House adjourned last week, and now the Senate is left with a couple of different options. They could adopt this new HB1 without any changes, or they could just let the bill die and there would not be any additional property tax relief as a result of this first special session. And again, that Senate version included that $100,000 for the homestead exemption. And I do want to note that when the governor did call his first special session, he did mark it with a special session number 1. So this is why we're expecting additional special sessions this summer, maybe even into the fall, that will focus on different priority items by the governor that did not pass during the regular session. And that is what we have for you today for legislative updates. We are happy to answer any questions. I don't see anything in the chat. Is there anything in the room?
Got one question.
Yes.
Going back to the armed individual, is it specific to being an employee at the school district, or it can be outsourced or anything like that? Does it?
I believe it can be contracted out. Yeah. I think that would, if I'm remembering correctly, that would go under the good cause exception, right? You would need to sort of work it through that process. But if I'm recalling, and again, we're going to get a whole lot more information from the agency on compliance on that. We kind of have some vague elements that are in the bill now to sort of try and read the tea leaves on. But if I'm remembering how that good cause provision is drafted, I do believe there's a way that allows a district to potentially contract that out. So no questions about House Bill 1. That's mind-boggling to me that for the first time in history, the rate you adopt is not going to be what's levied on your property owners. That's going to be a huge headache for a lot of y'all if that bill does pass. And so just the implementation of that's going to be very difficult. I don't think the legislature understands really what all that means.
And Josh, I think you've mentioned before that TA will have to calculate a reduced rate as well, and because school finance, state aid will depend on that. Can you talk more about how that will work?
Right. Yeah. So as y'all know, your funding, your state funding for tier 2 depends on your collections, right? And so if all these pieces aren't fitting together correctly and in sync, right, then if your assessor collector is reducing your rate by 16 cents and TA doesn't adjust for it on the formula, then when you go and report your collections to the agency, it'll look really bad, right? Because your rate's been reduced. But there's provisions in House Bill 1. I think they've, even though it's kind of put together very quickly, they have pointed out some things that they need to adjust, all together. And in particular, the tier 2 funding is a big one. And then also, I know there's not a whole lot of recapture districts. Are there any recapture districts in the room or in Zoom? I'm going to skip over that, but there is a provision in there that is important for recapture districts because they could be potentially taken out of recapture due to this, and they get some preferential treatment being a recapture district, and so they wanted to preserve that preferential treatment, so they were able to get that in the bill. Yeah, so that's House Bill 1 in a nutshell. We'll keep you posted. I think the Senate, Amy, the Senate comes back on tomorrow. Is that right?
Yes, they'll be back in the House. We're in their chamber tomorrow.
Yeah. I think I'm not sure if there's a limit on the special sessions. I think usually they go 30 days. And so I don't know if the Senate keeps on kind of kicking the can down the road and kind of waiting, I guess, for the governor to back off on his insistence to only look at tax compression rather than adopt what the Senate wants to do with the homestead exemption. So right now we're just kind of in this silly game of chicken. You'd think with Republicans kind of running all the state offices and both chambers and everything at state level, that if they could agree on something, it would be property tax relief. But they're arguing right now on how to deliver that property tax relief. And so we'll see who blinks. But that's where things are now.
Yeah, and we'll definitely keep you updated as this progresses or does not progress.